Have you ever noticed how quickly someone's behavior changes once they start believing your life already belongs to them? Because entitlement rarely begins loudly. It starts quietly, through assumptions, through small acts of control, through little decisions made without asking until one day you realize your own home no longer fully feels like yours anymore. And that's exactly how everything started with my son. Not with cruelty, not at first, with confidence, dangerous confidence, the kind that slowly grows when people convince themselves your future already belongs to them emotionally. Have you ever realized how painful it feels when someone starts acting like they're doing you a favor inside the home you worked your entire life to build? Because that realization changed everything for me. At first, the changes seemed harmless enough. My son started helping around the house more often after my husband passed away. He fixed shelves, rearranged furniture, handled repairs I no longer wanted to deal with alone. Again, thoughtful on the surface, loving even, but slowly something inside me began feeling uncomfortable. Have you ever accepted someone's help while secretly feeling pieces of your authority disappearing at the same time? Because that contradiction became exhausting emotionally. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and realized my son had completely reorganized the cabinets without asking me first. Every plate, every glass, every drawer. When I calmly mentioned preferring things the old way, he smiled casually and said, "Mom, this setup makes more sense now. Makes more sense now." Have you ever noticed how quickly people stop asking your opinion once they start believing they know better? Because that shift changes relationships permanently. Then the decisions became bigger. Furniture moved without discussion. Bills simplified online. Repair appointments scheduled before anyone consulted me first. Slowly, my own home started changing around me while I stood inside it feeling strangely invisible. Have you ever realized people can slowly take control of your environment before they ever openly challenge your authority? Because that realization terrified me more than I wanted to admit. And perhaps the hardest part was this: my son genuinely believed he was helping me. That's what made everything feel so emotionally confusing. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly erase someone's independence? Because independence was exactly what I felt slipping away piece by piece. Then came the sentence that stayed inside my head long afterward. One evening during dinner, while discussing repairs on the house, my son laughed casually and said, "Well, it's basically our house now anyway. Our house." Have you ever heard someone quietly claim ownership over something that still belongs to you completely? Because sitting there hearing those words felt surreal. At first, I thought maybe I misunderstood him. But then I noticed my daughter-in-law smiling slightly beside him like the statement was perfectly normal. Have you ever seen people become comfortable with assumptions they were never given permission to make? Because that moment changed how I saw everything afterward. Slowly, my opinions inside my own home started carrying less weight. If I disagreed about changes, I was told I was being stubborn. If I questioned decisions, concern immediately appeared. "We're only trying to make things easier for you." Easier. Such a beautiful word attached to something that suddenly felt dangerous. Have you ever noticed how control sounds kinder once it learns how to disguise itself emotionally? Because kindness was exactly what made the situation so painful. My son started spending more time discussing future planning now too, casual conversations about property, finances, and what would happen later. Again, always framed as responsibility. Practicality, preparation. But underneath those calm discussions lived something much heavier. Have you ever realized people often prepare emotionally for your absence long before you're actually gone? Because that understanding frightened me deeply. One afternoon, I overheard my son talking privately with his wife in the living room while they thought I was upstairs resting. Normally, I would have ignored it. But then I heard my house mentioned directly. Have you ever heard your own life discussed like you were no longer fully part of it? Because standing quietly near the hallway, listening to that conversation changed everything for me. My son casually said, "Once everything's officially handled later, we can finally renovate properly." Officially handled later. Have you ever realized people sometimes reveal their true expectations accidentally when they think you're no longer paying attention carefully? Because hearing those words settled heavily inside me. Suddenly, every strange moment from the past few months started connecting together differently: the rearranged rooms, the growing control, the casual assumptions about the future. And slowly, a terrifying realization began forming inside my mind. My son no longer saw himself as someone temporarily helping his mother. He was beginning to see himself as the future owner of my life, my home, and my decisions. Have you ever realized entitlement grows strongest once someone stops seeing you as fully in charge anymore? Because that realization changed everything for me. Later that night, standing alone in the quiet kitchen, looking around the house my husband and I spent decades building together, I suddenly understood something deeply painful. My son no longer acted like a guest helping his mother. He was starting to behave like someone waiting for ownership. And the most dangerous part, he genuinely believed the future already belonged to him. And the next decision my son made inside my own house made me realize just how far his sense of entitlement had already gone. Have you ever realized there's a terrifying moment when someone stops acting like a guest in your life and starts acting like the owner instead? Because entitlement doesn't arrive all at once, it grows quietly through small decisions, casual assumptions, and the slow belief that your voice matters less than theirs. And that's exactly what started happening inside my home after my son casually said, "It's basically our house now anyway, our house." Those words stayed inside my mind constantly afterward. Have you ever noticed how certain sentences permanently change the way you see someone? Because after hearing that, I started paying attention differently. And the more I observed, the more uncomfortable I became inside my own home. At first, the changes still sounded practical enough. My son insisted certain repairs needed to happen immediately. He started discussing future renovations constantly. Furniture moved without asking me first. Rooms reorganized according to what made more sense now. Have you ever realized people can slowly reshape your environment while convincing themselves they're improving it for you? Because that realization changes everything around you. One afternoon, I came downstairs and discovered my son had cleared out several boxes from the garage while I was resting upstairs. Old family things, my husband's tools. Decorations I still cared about deeply. When I asked where they went, he casually explained he donated some unnecessary clutter because the house needed simplifying. Simplifying. Have you ever had someone quietly erase pieces of your life while smiling kindly to your face? Because standing there listening to him explain this calmly felt surreal. I tried objecting gently at first. I explained those things still mattered to me, but immediately concern appeared. "Mom, you can't keep holding on to everything forever, forever." Have you ever noticed how quickly people start deciding what parts of your life still deserve space? Because that realization hurt more than I expected. Slowly, my opinions inside my own home started carrying less and less weight. If I disagreed with changes, I was being emotional. If I questioned decisions, I was making things harder than necessary. Have you ever realized people can slowly make you feel unreasonable simply for wanting authority over your own life? Because that trap felt impossible to escape emotionally. And perhaps the hardest part was this: my son genuinely believed he was helping me. That's what made the situation feel so deeply confusing. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly become disrespect? Because disrespect was exactly what I felt growing around me every day. Then came the dinner conversation that changed everything permanently. We were sitting together discussing household bills when my son suddenly started talking about future ownership responsibilities casually, almost like the subject already belonged to him emotionally. Have you ever heard someone discussing your future, like your role inside it was already shrinking? Because sitting there listening to him speak that way made my stomach tight immediately. He started talking about what needed to happen later to make things easier for everyone. Easier for everyone. Such calm words hiding such dangerous meaning underneath them. Have you ever realized control always sounds practical in the beginning, because practicality became the perfect disguise for entitlement? My daughter-in-law joined the conversation too now, discussing renovations and long-term plans openly while barely looking at me anymore. It felt less like they were discussing possibilities and more like they were planning ownership. Have you ever realized people sometimes emotionally move into your future before you even agree to give it away? Because that realization terrified me deeply. Then my son said something that stayed inside my head for days afterward. He laughed casually and said, "Eventually the house will need someone younger managing everything anyway." Someone younger managing everything anyway. Have you ever heard someone quietly announce that your authority already has an expiration date? Because hearing that inside the home I built with my husband nearly broke something inside me emotionally. And still, they acted like I should feel grateful for all of it. That was the strangest part. Every controlling decision came wrapped in concern. Every disrespectful assumption disguised itself as responsibility. Have you ever noticed how impossible it feels to argue against people who genuinely believe they're helping you? Because that emotional confusion exhausted me constantly. After that dinner, I started noticing even more changes around the house. My son handled mail before I saw it, bills discussed privately, phone calls lowering in volume when I entered rooms unexpectedly. Have you ever entered your own kitchen and suddenly felt like the outsider? Because that loneliness settles deeply inside a person. One evening, while walking quietly toward the living room, I overheard my son speaking privately with his wife again. This time, his tone sounded calmer, more confident somehow. Have you ever overheard someone speaking about your future like ownership was already guaranteed? Because standing there silently near the hallway, I suddenly felt colder than I had in years. My son casually said, "Once everything's officially transferred later, things will finally become easier." Officially transferred. Have you ever heard words that instantly change the meaning of everything around you? Because hearing that sentence made every strange moment from the past few months connect together perfectly. This was no longer only about helping me manage the house. My son had already started imagining the home belonged to him emotionally. And the most dangerous part, he genuinely believed I was becoming too weak or too unaware to stop him. But while my son quietly planned for ownership, he made one huge mistake. He underestimated how much I still understood. Have you ever realized the most dangerous thing about entitlement is how quickly people stop hiding it once they believe you no longer have the strength to challenge them? Because once someone convinces themselves your future already belongs to them, their behavior changes quietly. They stop asking permission, stop respecting boundaries, and eventually stop seeing you as fully in control anymore. And that's exactly what started happening inside my home after I overheard my son talking about things being officially transferred later. Officially transferred. Those words echoed inside my mind constantly afterward. Have you ever noticed how certain sentences permanently change the way you see people? Because after hearing that, I started paying attention differently. And the more I observed, the clearer the truth became. My son no longer behaved like someone temporarily helping his mother. He behaved like someone slowly preparing for ownership. Have you ever realized people often emotionally claim things long before they legally possess them? Because that realization terrified me deeply. At first, the changes still looked harmless enough from the outside. My son handled more mail before I ever saw it, bills discussed privately between him and his wife, repair decisions already made before asking me, again, always framed as responsibility, practicality, concern. But underneath those calm explanations lived something much heavier. Have you ever noticed how quickly help becomes authority once people stop viewing your opinion as necessary? Because that shift changes relationships permanently. One afternoon, I came home from visiting an old friend and discovered several pieces of furniture moved again without anyone discussing it with me first. My husband's favorite chair had disappeared from the living room completely. When I asked about it later, my son casually explained they moved it into storage because the room worked better this way. Worked better this way. Have you ever had someone quietly erase pieces of your life while expecting gratitude in return? Because standing there listening to him explain that calmly felt surreal, I tried objecting gently at first. I explained the chair mattered to me emotionally, but immediately the concern returned. "Mom, you need to stop holding on to the past so much." The past. Have you ever realized people sometimes treat your memories like obstacles once they start imagining your future without you fully in control? Because that realization hurt more than anger ever could. Slowly, my own home stopped feeling fully mine anymore. Conversations happened around me instead of with me. Decisions made for my benefit without asking what I wanted first. Every little change carried the same dangerous assumption underneath it all that eventually my authority wouldn't matter much anyway. Have you ever realized people can slowly reduce your role inside your own life without officially announcing it? Because that realization changed everything for me. And perhaps the hardest part was this: my son genuinely believed he was helping me. That's what made the situation feel so emotionally complicated. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly become entitlement? Because entitlement was exactly what I felt growing around me every day. Then came the conversation that removed all remaining doubt completely. One night after dinner, while everyone thought I had gone upstairs to sleep, I overheard my son speaking quietly with his wife in the kitchen again. Normally, I would have ignored it, but then I heard my house mentioned directly. Have you ever heard your own future discussed, like you were no longer fully part of the conversation anymore? Because standing silently near that dark hallway changed everything for me. My son calmly said, "Once mom can't really manage things anymore, we'll already have everything prepared. Prepared." Have you ever noticed how dangerous preparation becomes once people emotionally decide your independence is temporary? Because hearing those words made my chest tighten instantly. Then my daughter in law asked whether they should start handling more financial things now before it gets complicated later. Before it gets complicated later. Such calm language, such dangerous meaning underneath it. Have you ever realized control always sounds responsible while it's slowly growing? Because that understanding terrified me deeply. And then my son said something that hurt more than every hidden conversation before it. He quietly laughed and said, "Honestly, she barely notices half the changes already. Barely notices." Have you ever heard someone quietly decide you're no longer fully aware of your own life? Because that kind of pain reaches somewhere words barely touch. Standing there silently listening to my own son speak about me like I was slowly disappearing mentally, I suddenly realized something deeply important. This was no longer simply about helping me manage the house. My son had emotionally replaced me already. The real me, the woman who built that home, protected that family, and sacrificed decades for them, was slowly being replaced by a weaker version easier to ignore, supervise, and eventually control. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase your authority while still believing they love you? Because that realization changes everything. But strangely enough, instead of feeling helpless after overhearing that conversation, I felt clearer than ever before. Because uncertainty finally disappeared completely. Have you ever noticed how dangerous clarity becomes once denial finally ends? Because now I fully understood what was happening around me. My son no longer saw the house as mine. He saw it as something already becoming his. And because he believed I was too weak or too unaware to stop him, he stopped hiding his intentions carefully anymore. Have you ever watched people become careless simply because they underestimated you completely? Because that underestimation became my greatest advantage. From that moment forward, I stopped reacting emotionally entirely. I smiled politely, nodded calmly, allowed my son to continue believing his version of reality completely, and while he focused on preparing for ownership, I quietly started preparing something he never expected me capable of doing behind his back. Because the next thing I discovered hidden inside my own house exposed just how far my son's plans had already gone. What if the people quietly planning your future forgot one very important thing, that you were still paying attention? Because there's something dangerous about underestimating someone. You stop hiding the truth carefully, and that's exactly what my son failed to realize after convincing himself I no longer fully understood what was happening inside my own home. He thought I didn't notice anymore. That was his biggest mistake. Have you ever noticed how quickly people become careless once they believe they already have control? Because after overhearing those conversations in the kitchen, I started observing everything differently. Every whisper, every sudden silence, every document moved without explanation. And the more I watched, the more frightening the truth became. My son no longer acted like someone helping his mother temporarily. He acted like someone preparing for ownership. Have you ever realized people often emotionally claim your life long before they legally touch it? Because that realization changed everything for me. From that moment forward, I stopped reacting emotionally altogether. That part mattered, because if my son realized I understood what he was planning, he would become careful again. And right now, his confidence was exposing far too much. Have you ever stayed quiet simply because silence gave you access to the truth? Because silence became my strongest weapon. I stopped arguing about little changes around the house. I stopped correcting people when they spoke about future plans casually around me. And because of that, my son relaxed even more. Have you ever watched people lower their guard completely because they believed they already controlled the situation? Because his confidence became my greatest advantage. One afternoon, while everyone was out running errands, I went into the downstairs office searching for a family photo album my husband used to keep there. Instead, I found something else entirely, a folder partially hidden beneath stacks of paperwork. At first, I almost ignored it, but something inside me stopped. Have you ever felt your instincts warning you before your mind fully understood why? Because that feeling changed everything. I opened the folder carefully, and within seconds my hands started shaking. Financial records, property documents, notes discussing future transfer planning, lists about renovations after ownership transition, ownership transition. Have you ever found proof of something you desperately hoped existed only inside your imagination? Because sitting there alone in that quiet room, I suddenly understood the terrifying truth completely. My son wasn't simply imagining a future where the house might someday belong to him naturally. He was actively preparing for it already, quietly, strategically, emotionally, and the most dangerous part. He believed I would never fully realize what he was doing. Have you ever realized people become bold once they stop seeing you clearly? Because that underestimation became my greatest advantage. I carefully continued reading through the papers, discussions about making things easier later, financial management notes, conversations about protecting the property properly moving forward, such calm language. Such dangerous meaning underneath it. Have you ever noticed how entitlement always disguises itself as responsibility? Because responsibility had become the perfect excuse for control inside my family. Then I found something that hurt more than everything else combined, a handwritten note beside one document that simply said, "Once mom can't manage things fully anymore, can't manage things fully anymore." Have you ever read words that instantly changed how safe your own family felt? Because that sentence nearly broke something inside me emotionally. Sitting there in silence, staring at the life my husband and I built together slowly being discussed like an upcoming transfer instead of a home, I suddenly realized something deeply painful. My son no longer viewed me as the owner of this house emotionally. He viewed me as temporary, an obstacle between him and the future he already imagined belonged to him. Have you ever realized entitlement grows strongest once people stop fully seeing your humanity? Because that realization changes relationships forever. But strangely enough, instead of feeling helpless after discovering those papers, I felt calmer. Clearer because uncertainty finally disappeared completely. Have you ever noticed how dangerous clarity becomes once denial finally ends? Because now I fully understood what I was dealing with. My son believed aging made me weak. He believed loneliness made me dependent. And worst of all, he believed I was too distracted, too emotional, or too forgetful to protect myself properly anymore. That belief became his greatest mistake. I carefully returned every paper exactly where I found it before anyone came home. That part mattered, because if my son realized I understood the truth, everything would change. He would become cautious, defensive, harder to expose. And right now, he was still revealing far too much. Have you ever stayed silent because silence gave you time to prepare? Because from that moment forward, preparation became my focus completely. I stopped feeling afraid after that day, truly afraid, because fear disappeared once I finally understood the truth clearly. In its place came something much more dangerous: clarity. And while my son quietly prepared for the house to become his someday, I had already started planning something he never imagined I was still capable of doing behind his back. Because the next phone call I secretly made behind my son's back changed the entire balance of power inside that house forever. What happens when the person everyone quietly underestimated finally stops reacting emotionally and starts protecting themselves strategically instead? Because there's something dangerous about believing someone is powerless. You stop imagining they're still capable of fighting back, and that's exactly what my son failed to realize while he spent months quietly preparing for my house to become his someday. He believed I was becoming weaker every day, but secretly, I had already started taking my power back. Have you ever realized people often become most vulnerable the moment they think they already won? Because my son's confidence became my greatest advantage. The morning I made that phone call, my hands shook slightly dialing the number, not from fear, not from confusion, from clarity. Have you ever made a decision that instantly changed how powerless you felt? Because that call changed something deep inside me immediately. I contacted someone completely outside the family, independent, professional. Someone whose opinion couldn't be shaped by assumptions about aging, loneliness, or emotional pressure. And for the first time in months, someone finally spoke to me directly instead of around me. Have you ever realized how different it feels when someone treats you like a capable adult again after months of quiet supervision? Because hearing my own voice taken seriously nearly made me emotional. I explained everything carefully. The conversations, the hidden paperwork, the growing sense of entitlement inside my own home, the feeling that my son no longer saw me as fully in control of my own life or my own property. Have you ever finally spoken the truth out loud after carrying it silently for months? Because that moment changed everything for me. The response shocked me more than anything else. Calmly, professionally, I was reminded of something nobody inside my own family had bothered reminding me of in a very long time. The house still belonged to me, completely, legally, fully. Have you ever realized how powerful it feels when someone reminds you you still have authority over your own life? Because after months of feeling quietly erased inside my own home, that realization felt overwhelming emotionally. I started organizing my own protection privately after that call: legal advice, financial reviews, property documentation, every step carefully planned, every move completely hidden from my son. And because he still believed I was passive, emotional, and unaware, he never noticed any of it happening. Have you ever realized underestimated people often become invisible in the most useful way possible? Because invisibility became my strongest weapon. Meanwhile, my son continued growing more confident every day. Conversations about the house became increasingly casual around me now. Renovations, future plans, financial ideas. He spoke about things like ownership was already emotionally settled. Have you ever noticed how expectations slowly become entitlement once people stop questioning themselves? Because entitlement changes behavior quickly. Then came the dinner that changed everything completely. My son brought paperwork to the table again, speaking gently, patiently, carefully, the same careful tone people use with someone they no longer fully respect as independent. He explained these were simple planning documents designed to make things easier later, easier later. Such calm words attached to something that suddenly felt terrifyingly clear. Have you ever realized control sounds kindest right before it asks for permission? Because that's exactly what this moment became. Everyone around the table watched me quietly now, waiting, expecting hesitation, expecting surrender. But what they didn't know was this: while they spent months building a future around my weakness, I had already rebuilt my strength behind their backs. Have you ever known a moment was about to change everything before anyone else in the room realized it yet? Because sitting there looking down at those papers, I understood something deeply important. My son still believed he controlled this situation completely, but he had no idea the woman he quietly underestimated had already uncovered every part of his plan long before this dinner even started. I looked calmly at the documents for several seconds before finally asking one simple question: why would I sign anything after what my attorney explained to me? Silence, complete silence. Have you ever watched confidence disappear from someone's face instantly? Because that's exactly what happened around that dinner table. My son froze. My daughter-in-law stared at me in shock. And suddenly, for the first time in months, the entire story they built about my weakness started collapsing right in front of them. Have you ever seen people suddenly realize they underestimated you completely? Because that realization is impossible to hide, I stayed calm after that. Calmness mattered now more than ever. I explained quietly that after discovering the hidden paperwork and overhearing conversations for months, I had already contacted professionals privately myself. Independent legal advice, independent financial protection. Everything they believed I was too weak, too emotional, or too forgetful to handle alone, I had already handled successfully behind their backs. Have you ever realized the people questioning your capability often panic most when you prove them wrong? Because panic filled the room completely now. And suddenly, for the very first time in a very long time, nobody at that table was speaking to me like I was powerless anymore. But what my son admitted after the truth finally came out hurt more than every hidden paper and whispered conversation combined. What hurts more than discovering someone quietly planned around your future is realizing they truly believed they had the right to do it, because the deepest kind of betrayal doesn't always come from hatred, it comes from entitlement. From fear, from people slowly convincing themselves your voice matters less than their plans for your life. And that painful truth became impossible to ignore after my son realized the woman he underestimated had understood everything all along. The room stayed completely silent after I mentioned speaking with attorneys privately. Not angry silence at first, shocked silence. The kind that appears when reality suddenly changes too fast for people to hide their emotions properly. Have you ever watched certainty disappear from someone's face in real time? Because that's exactly what I saw sitting around that dinner table. My son looked stunned, truly stunned. For months, he believed he was gradually preparing for a future where the house would naturally become his responsibility. And suddenly, the entire story he built emotionally about me cracked open right in front of him. Have you ever realized people sometimes believe their own assumptions so deeply they stop questioning whether they're actually fair, because that realization changes relationships forever? The questions came quickly afterward, too quickly. Too emotionally. Why would I contact attorneys without telling him? Why involve outsiders? Why would I assume the worst about family? But listening to those questions felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. Have you ever noticed how people become hurt by your boundaries when they already expected control, because expectations change how people interpret your independence completely? I answered calmly. That part mattered. Because by then, I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. I was trying to reclaim my dignity. I explained something simple. I contacted professionals because nobody inside my own home was speaking honestly to me anymore. They were speaking about me, around me, over me, but rarely directly to me. Have you ever realized people can slowly take away your voice while convincing themselves they're helping you? Because that realization hurts deeper than anger ever could. My daughter-in-law stayed quiet almost the entire time, but my son finally admitted something that hurt more than every hidden document, every whispered conversation, every rearranged room combined. He looked at me quietly and said, "We thought you couldn't handle things alone anymore. Couldn't handle things alone anymore." Have you ever heard someone you love quietly admit they stopped believing in your strength completely? Because that kind of pain reaches somewhere words barely touch. For a moment, I couldn't even answer, not because I felt weak, but because suddenly I understood the real betrayal underneath everything. This was never only about the house. It was about identity. My son had slowly replaced the real me with a weaker version, easier to supervise emotionally. A lonely older woman, fragile, dependent, someone whose authority no longer fully mattered. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase your independence while still believing they love you completely? Because that realization changes something permanent inside you. I finally looked directly at my son and told him something I had carried silently for months. I said aging does not erase a lifetime of intelligence. Loneliness does not remove someone's right to make decisions. And needing occasional help does not mean surrendering your home, your authority, or your dignity completely. Have you ever realized dignity matters just as much as safety? Because that truth became clearer to me than anything else during this entire experience. I also admitted something harder to say aloud. The most painful part wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't the conversations about future ownership. It wasn't even watching my own house slowly change around me. The most painful part was realizing my own son stopped seeing me clearly. Have you ever realized how lonely it feels when the people you raised begin questioning whether you still deserve full control over your own life? Because that loneliness changes you deeply. The room stayed quiet after that, but differently now. Honest quiet, no pretending anymore, no fake reassurance, just truth finally sitting openly between all of us. And strangely enough, that truth brought relief too, because for the first time in months, nobody was treating me like I was disappearing anymore. Nobody was speaking over me. Nobody was quietly planning my future without me in the room. They were finally listening, truly listening. Have you ever noticed how quickly power returns once people finally acknowledge your voice again? Because that recognition changes everything. I didn't feel victorious sitting there. That's important. This was never about humiliating my son or proving I was smarter than him. It was about reclaiming myself before I slowly disappeared inside everyone else's assumptions about aging and weakness. And thankfully, I realized what was happening before it became permanent. Later that night, after everyone left and the house became quiet again, I sat alone thinking about how easily ordinary family concern had slowly transformed into entitlement inside my own home. One small mistake. One vulnerable moment, one assumption about aging, tiny things that slowly became permission for others to imagine control over my future while calling it help. And suddenly, I understood something deeply important. People may underestimate your strength, they may question your independence, they may even convince themselves your life already belongs to them emotionally. But real authority, the kind built through experience, sacrifice, and self-respect, is much harder to take away than people think. And the final thing I said before leaving that dinner table left my son completely silent. What happens after people finally realize they crossed the line between helping someone and quietly taking over their life? Because the hardest truth for my son to face wasn't that I uncovered the paperwork or contacted attorneys behind his back. It was realizing he slowly stopped seeing me as a strong, capable woman and started seeing me as someone whose authority no longer fully mattered. And once that truth entered the room, nothing inside our family felt the same anymore. The silence after our conversation that night felt heavier than any argument ever could. Not angry silence, reflective silence. The kind that appears when people suddenly recognize parts of themselves they never wanted to see clearly before. Have you ever watched someone realize their good intentions caused real damage? Because that realization sat across the dinner table from me now. My daughter in law looked uncomfortable and emotionally exhausted. My son looked shaken in a way I had never seen before. And for the first time in a very long time, nobody was treating me like I was weak anymore. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody explained things to me slowly. Nobody acted like my opinions were temporary obstacles standing in the way of what was best. They were finally seeing me clearly again, truly clearly. Have you ever noticed how quickly respect returns once people realize they can no longer control the story about you? Because that shift changes everything. But even then, something inside me still hurt deeply. Not because my son worried about me growing older. Fear is human, I understood that. The real pain came from realizing how quickly fear turned into entitlement. How easily concern became permission to slowly imagine ownership over my life, my home, and my future. Have you ever realized people can cross dangerous lines very slowly while still believing they're loving you? Because that understanding changed me permanently. My son finally looked at me quietly and admitted something painful. He said, "I thought I was preparing for the future." And strangely enough, I believed him. That was the complicated truth underneath everything. I do believe my son loved me. I do believe he was trying to protect what he thought would eventually become his responsibility. But love mixed with entitlement becomes dangerous once it stops respecting the person it claims to protect. Have you ever realized real love protects someone's dignity too, not just their future? Because dignity was the part of me I nearly lost inside my own home. I finally told my son something I had been carrying silently for months. I said helping someone does not give you ownership over them. Concern does not erase boundaries, and aging does not make someone invisible inside their own life. Have you ever realized freedom isn't only about money or property? Sometimes it's about being trusted to remain yourself. Because that truth became clearer to me than anything else. The room stayed quiet after that, but this time the silence felt softer somehow, honest. For the first time in months, nobody was trying to convince me of anything anymore. Nobody was discussing future planning over my head. Nobody was treating my voice like something temporary. They were finally listening without controlling. Have you ever noticed how powerful it feels when your voice fully belongs to you again? Because after months of feeling quietly erased inside my own home, that feeling almost overwhelmed me emotionally. I also admitted something difficult that night. I told my son I understood why he became afraid after seeing me struggle occasionally or grow older. Aging is frightening, not only for the person living through it, but for the people watching it happen too. But fear does not erase someone's humanity. Fear does not transfer ownership over another person's life. Have you ever realized people can unintentionally dehumanize someone simply by becoming too afraid to lose them? Because that realization sat heavily between all of us. My son apologized quietly for making me feel powerless inside my own home. He admitted somewhere along the way he stopped asking what I wanted because he convinced himself he already knew better. And hearing that hurt, but it also explained everything. Have you ever realized entitlement often begins the moment someone believes your choices matter less than their plans? Because that understanding changes how you see relationships forever. I didn't leave that table feeling victorious. That's important. This was never about humiliating my son or proving I was smarter than him. It was about reclaiming myself before I slowly disappeared inside everyone else's assumptions about aging and weakness. And thankfully, I realized what was happening before it became permanent. Later that night, after everyone left and the house became quiet again, I sat alone in the living room thinking about how easily ordinary family concern had slowly turned into entitlement inside my own home. One small mistake. One vulnerable moment. One assumption about aging. Tiny things that slowly became permission for someone else to imagine ownership over my future while calling it help. And suddenly, I understood something deeply important. People may underestimate your strength. They may question your independence. They may even convince themselves your home, your future, or your life already belongs to them emotionally. But real authority, the kind built through sacrifice, resilience, and self respect, is much harder to erase than people think. And while my son spent months quietly preparing for the house to become his someday, he forgot one very important thing. I was still standing. My son thought the house already belonged to him, but he forgot I was still standing.